Good morning. Welcome to our Understanding Grief workshop. I'm glad to have you here. This is a little bit of a different venue than normal, but I'm glad that you're here with us today. So, to tell you a little bit about this workshop, I really started probably about over 10 years ago. I would have people call into the Center for Grief and Healing and they would say, I want to come to the grief class. And I would say, well, we don't have a grief class, but we have grief support group. And they'd say, well, I don't really want to talk about my grief. I just want to come learn about my grief. So we created this workshop. And so it isn't a support group format. For those of you that are joining via Zoom, you have the opportunity to chat in, and I'm going to ask a question of you that you can then put in the chat box. And so Candace can open that up. So again, welcome. And what I also want to say is it isn't uncommon as I share about grief and the journey of grief that it may also be triggering, right? Because many of you are grieving your own loss at this time. So just encouraging you to take care of your heart, nurture your heart, and if you need to get up or get some fresh air, to just honor that which you need for yourself. So I would like to begin with the question that I invite you to think about. So I'm going to begin in reading. This is a traditional Jewish prayer, and it's called We Come Together. We come together as people drawn to life, and yet people acquainted with death. We come full of our memories, those memories that are hard for us to bear, those memories that lift us and give us meaning, those memories that give us the courage to go on. We come together today knowing that we're not alone, that others struggle even as we struggle, that others love even as we have loved, and we love still. We come together knowing that others hope even as we try to hope, clinging to the assurances that help us make our way from hour to hour, from day to day. May we find our full share of love and hope now in this hour of togetherness. So as mentioned, I want you to think about this question and answer this. What is your biggest challenge or concern in your grief journey today? And so I invite you to take a couple of minutes and to answer that, and we'll collect those responses. And then for those of you that are via Zoom, you can also send those in. And about 3/4 of the way through, I'll review those questions. So when we talk about the journey of grief, there's a few things that we know for sure, but sometimes these things can surprise us. So we know that the journey of grief is often unpredictable, which is a real challenge for us in terms of how feelings will wave in, and sometimes at moments when we least expected them to, right? And so that course can feel unpredictable to us. It's not linear. And many times people will say, I know grievers do not like hearing this, and people will say, well, time will heal, which never feels supportive when you're the one grieving, right? Because that doesn't really validate where we're at. But what happens in that is then sometimes people feel like, okay, so then I just kind of go on this journey. If time heals, then it just gets better, 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 right? And I do this climb. But we know, right? And those of you grieving know that it is really unpredictable and that there's a lot of waves and it's very up and down. And we also know that grief is unending. And that can be hard to hear when you're in grief, right? For me to say that. So let me explain it a little bit. I do use a lot of metaphors when I talk about grief because I don't think there's a lot of words that really describe what grief is. But I do think that there's metaphors that you will be able to relate to. So in terms of it being end-ending, I talk about it like this. It's like when someone dies, we get a hole in our heart. And our heart even hurts when we grieve, right? And I'm sure that that's where the term heartache came from. And so we know at times in our journey that scab may start to form and then it comes off, right? And then it forms and then it comes off. And so what we also know is even through the years, and if you can reflect on losses previously in your life, maybe years ago, there's times that that scab still comes off, right? That you will think about that loved one. Maybe it's even been 10, 15 years. So in that, grief is unending in that way because there's always going to be times in our life when we miss them, when we have a moment and we want them to be there and we want them to be present. One of my favorite quotes is death ends a lifetime, but not a relationship. And so, of course, in grief, it's so difficult because we don't have that physical connection to this person that we love so much, right? And that absence is so painful. Yet our relationship continues. And that's part of what we are doing on this grief journey. It's like sorting through, how do I stay connected? What does my relationship look like now? Okay. So this quote by Alan Wellfelt, grief work fills up my heart and demands my every attention. I come to know myself in ways I never knew existed. I feel like grieving is definitely one of the most difficult things that we do in life, right? And so it's very challenging in so many ways. And I really acknowledge all of you that are here that are grieving or have had a recent loss because it takes a lot even to come to this workshop, right? And know the feelings that may get evoked. So it really taxes us in many ways. So a few things that I think are important to talk about grief is it does, and I have to start by saying it does not feel normal, but it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So we're so created to love and attach and connect. And then when we have this loss and this separation, we grieve. We weep, our hearts weep. We feel it in our whole being, right? So that is a normal reaction because we love and attach in an abnormal situation. And I remember one time hearing an analogy. It's like when grief happens, when someone we love dies, it's like a snow globe just gets shook. And just everything, feels kind of scattered and doesn't feel settled. And so we're experiencing all of that we would see when we look at a snow globe, right? And the other thing that it's so important to remember about grief is it's very unique. So almost 20 years doing this work, I have never seen two people that grieve exactly the same. I definitely see similarities, but we all grieve differently. And there's things that impact that I'll talk about. And we grieve differently through our lives based on where we're at in our lives. And why I really want you to remember that it's unique is because many times I'll hear people compare to someone else's grief. Well, when my neighbor's husband died, it didn't seem like her journey was as painful, or, she didn't seem to respond in the same way. And many times people have a lot of self-judgment about that. And I'll say, this is your journey. And that's not wrong. And it won't look like anyone else's. So it's really important to remember that for yourself as well. So here's some fears regarding grief that I think that you may be able to recognize or be familiar with. So how about feeling that loss of control? That really ties into the unpredictability. And so you can be, going along and all of a sudden grief just hits. And that can feel a loss of control. The emotions come, and so that can be difficult. And another symptom that is very high for people in grief is anxiety. And so I'll describe it like this. When we feel in control, so here's control. When we feel in control, our anxiety goes down. But when we don't feel in control, our anxiety goes up. So Anxiety is not an uncommon symptom that people experience in grief, but often surprises people. How about appearing weak to others? Because if I said to you, I saw Candace at her mother's funeral last week, and Candace was so strong. What did Candace probably look like? She probably, in our worldview, I'm going to guess that if most people said that, then Candace probably wasn't crying, was more stoic. Okay, and that's how we define strong. That's not how I define strong, or us here in the Center for Grief and Healing. We think it takes a lot of strength to grieve, and we say if people are responding in that way, that's not wrong either, but that's just where they're at in that moment. But what happens in our head then, we say, oh, that must mean if we're crying, then we're weak, right? The opposite. And I will often say, we don't cry in grief because we're weak. We cry because someone that we love has died. And that makes us sad. That makes our hearts sad. So it's not about weakness, but culturally, we often equate it to that. Sometimes people will say, I feel like, Kathy, if I let my tears come, they are not going to stop. And I think that kind of ties into those top two also, right? That feeling of loss of control. If I let my tears come, they won't stop. That vulnerability. And so that can be very real for people to have that feeling. Also not uncommon for people to say, I don't know how I'm going to make it through this loss. I don't know that I'm ever going to be okay again. And I always reflect to this, and it comes to my mind pretty quick when I say this line. And I remember when my dad died, I was 26, and that was my first real loss. And I can still like visually go back to this, and this has been a number of years ago, sitting on the couch, and it was a couple days after his death, and saying to myself, I don't think I'm ever going to be happy again. And that was so real for me in that moment. Because when we're in it, it's hard to see out of it. Like rationally, if I talked through it, I probably would say, okay, Kathy, you will. Yet in that moment, that's how I felt. And so that can feel very real in that time. And then also that the deceased will be forgotten, right? Because we love this person, we have memories, they have a legacy, especially if it's a baby that others didn't know, like you knew as the parent, in pregnancy. And sometimes after people die, people stop saying their name, or they don't talk about them, or they say, I don't want to bring them up for fear of upsetting you. I hear that a lot. And people will say, well, I still want to talk about them. I remember a mom that I worked with, and she said, Kathy, I go in the lunchroom and everyone's telling stories about their children, and I still want to share about my son who has died. I still want to share those stories, right? So that doesn't end wanting to talk about them or share about them. And that's also a way that they kind of live on, right? So how do we experience grief? Those of you in grief or that have had grief, that have grieved, I know you're familiar with this. Yet some things, there are components that might surprise people. So we definitely experience grief physically. So for how many of you do you feel more tired or more fatigued? Yeah. You sometimes people will talk about more headaches or stomach aches or things like that, more susceptible to colds or flus that come around. And so we do experience it physically. And then emotionally, I think we're more familiar with that one, right? And we'll say we know of those emotions that come up, and maybe sadness or anger and the different things that wave in and out. And then also we experience grief cognitively. I would say that's the one that surprises people the most and sometimes scares them. Because what happens is it affects us cognitively in our memory, decision making, and concentration. Okay, so people, where are my keys? Where was I going? I remember a mother that the support group that I do is for parents who have lost their child, and I remember a mother years ago saying, "I literally stood in front of the milk at the grocery store, and just 1%, 2%, 1%, 2%." And what I talk about in that, it's like the rubber band stretched. Grief impacts us in so many ways that even decision making can feel difficult. Or for some of you, people will say, "Oh, I love to read. I'm an avid reader, and now in grief, I can't read." Concentration, that can be really difficult. Or I sat and just looked at my computer screen at work and felt like I was not very productive. So these are the cognitive impacts of grief. We also experience grief spiritually, and whatever that is for us. And so for some, there might be strong connection, support, nurturing that's happening related to that. And for some, there isn't. It's not uncommon to have existential questions like, well, what does this mean? And how does this go together? And so finding a place where you can process through that is really important too. And then we also experience grief behaviorally. So for how many of you do you feel more irritable, right? So irritability is a big symptom in grief. For some, we may seek reminders of our loved one. So there may be things that we want to draw near to us. And then for some, we may avoid them for a time. So people will say, "Oh, it's really hard for me to drive on fruit past the hospice home, or drive by Valley Children's Hospital," or things like that, right? So we may avoid those reminders for a while, which I would say is okay, and actually encourage. If there's something that feels really triggering for you and you want to avoid it, then avoid it. Take care of yourself and what you need in that. So I want to just talk about some grief responses and some things that we see and that are a part of many people's grief journey. And one is feelings of guilt and regret. Okay? And this is not uncommon, but it's difficult to process. Because when you go to process it with the people that you love, what do they typically say to you when you say, "I feel so guilty because I wish I would have spent more time with my dad"? So quickly, the people that love you, it's hard to be present in guilt because people want to quickly say, "No, don't feel that way. You shouldn't feel guilty," right? Because they're well-meaning and they want you to feel better. But I'm going to pretty much guarantee you that that did not take it away. It's not like people go, "Oh my gosh, thank you. I didn't even think of that," right? So we need to process through that. And so that's a lot of the work I feel like we do in Center for Grief and Healing. And a lot of that happens in group too. When people feel safe and they can start talking about that, is just processing through that guilt and just letting people explore that, because often when that happens in the exploration, people begin to make sense of it too. And it's really rooted in loss as well, and attachment. And so I always say, guilt and regret is, to me, it's a lot about love. And you love this person so much, and we wish that there's things that would have been different. Because in all relationships in life, there's things that we'll go, "Oh, I maybe would have done that different, or not said that, or not done that, or I wish I would have done that." Okay, that's just normal relationships. But then when someone dies, that can really come up for us. So one of the things that I do when I'm processing that with clients is I'll just let them explore it. "Well, tell me about what you wish you would have done different. And what do you think that would have looked like?" So maybe it's, "I saw some symptoms and I should have made my husband go to the doctor." And what happens is often people go to that, and then the next jump is if they would have gone to the doctor, they'd still be alive. So we do a pretty broad jump many times. So I'll just process, well, tell me about that. What were you seeing? And did you talk to him about that? And in the past, when you encouraged him to go to the doctor, what was that like? Just really exploring that with them. Because in that, many times people will have realizations. And then just also honoring that it is about love. And so just we might say, gosh, I wish I would have done this different or had this conversation. But what I want to just pause for a minute and encourage you. So you're thinking about this person that you're grieving, that you love. And I want you right now to think of one thing that you did for them that you're so glad you did. Okay. And then put that in your heart too. Because what happens is, oh, we can go to all the things we didn't do or we wish we would have done, but we aren't going to, gosh, I'm glad we did this. So encouraging you to have space to hold both and to honor that as well. So sometimes we feel guilt related to, we call it survivor guilt. Like, maybe it should have been me, or how did that happen to them? And I'm okay, and I can enjoy life, and they're not here. So things like that. And this is guilt that we process through as well. And then recovery guilt is a guilt that we hear a lot. I would say I hear a lot from parents is I went and had lunch with a friend and I laughed. And all of a sudden I heard myself laugh and said, what does that say about me as a parent? That I am grieving and that I could laugh. So really talking about we can't have, that we can't feel that intense grief 24/7. And sometimes there is a moment where you have, or some time that you have this distraction and you can laugh or you can feel some joy. That doesn't diminish your grief, your love, your connection. Actually, that might even nurture you a little bit, because we know in the waves of grief how then that often comes back in for us. So what do we do with guilt and regret? We process it. Maybe we write our loved one a letter and talk to them about it. So I'll talk to clients about, and I've done this myself, writing a letter to your loved one and talk about those things that you wish were different. And have that letter and kind of sit with that for a couple minutes, and then turn that paper over or take a fresh piece of paper and write a letter back to you from them. Because you know them, and I wonder what they would say to you. And so that can be an exercise as well. And again, we talked about what are we glad that we did for them. So making sure you go to that as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our support system. And I like this quote. Grief is such a lonely thing. There is no one in it with you. Others may grieve for the same soul, but they do not grieve exactly for what you also grieve. No one has lost precisely what you have lost. Not exactly, never exactly. We are in it alone. And what I think that symbolizes is your unique journey, and encouraging that without judgment, without self-judgment. And so when we talk about our support system, one thing that it's important to remember, so for some of you, your close support system is also grieving, and they're doing it a little bit differently. And so although they can be a strong support, sometimes they might not be available support at different times. A lot of times when I work with couples will even talk about, they kind of end up doing this, right? So when one is having a harder day, they feel like they'll kind of pull each other up. But you know what? Sometimes there's times when they're both here and they're saying, okay, who do we need to maybe reach out to and support? What do we need to do to support each other? I can tell you that almost every griever tells me in some fashion, Kathy, the people that I thought were going to be here for me, or the person I thought would be my primary support, is not here. And that can be really difficult. And that we also can grieve that as well, right? And I think there's different reasons for that. I think sometimes it's attached to people's vulnerability. They can't take your grief away. You may be representing, I say this to parents all the time, but it's across the board in grievers, but you represent sometimes one of their biggest fears. I think that happens a lot for parents because of that really out of the natural order. We don't anticipate that we will lose a child. And so for many, that's such a fear. And so they tend to be isolated more. But I think across the board in grievers, that happens. Um, and we talked about them being absent. And I think that the truth is, too, people aren't often aware of the reality of how long the journey of grief takes. And so you can often feel isolated by the experience. So sometimes we may get this message, too, right? If you could just go ahead and get over your grief already, that'd be great. We might get 2 days off work, right? And so we can sometimes get this message. And sometimes I think what people are saying is, I don't want to see you sad because that makes me have to feel. So can you get over this? And as we know, it doesn't happen like that. We don't just shut it off and be done with it. We are on this journey and we figure out how to care for ourselves along the way. And sometimes this is how we care for ourselves. Right? My mama told me sometimes people have to cry out all the tears to make room for a heart full of smiles. So when you come into the Center for Grief and Healing, for those of you that haven't been there, we do have a lot of tissue boxes. Or when you come to support group, there's a lot of tissue boxes. And in this room, there's a lot of tissue boxes. And I know that can feel vulnerable and like, what did we walk into? And I'll tell people, your tears are welcome here. This is a place that you can have tears. And the truth is, tears are productive. And I'm not sure if you knew that, but there's actually a difference of the chemical components that occur in tears of sadness or irritants tears. And so to remember that the components around the tears of sadness are also a release and biochemically are as well. So sometimes when I tell people they're productive, I think that they feel a little bit more comfortable with crying. But I understand that it's not always comfortable for everyone. And so finding that space or those people that you can just have your tears, right? So if someone cries in my office, I'm never going to go forward with a box of Kleenex because I never want to send the message like dry it up. Right? I understand we do that like as a courtesy, right? Like here's a tissue. But sometimes it can give a message like dry it up. And then I know we have Kleenex everywhere. So if they want to reach for one, they can. So just letting people cry as they need to and honoring a space for that. Grief can feel really isolating. Sometimes it is self-inflicted, like you want to isolate, you want to protect yourself. When someone dies, the world doesn't feel quite as safe sometimes, and so you may find that you pull in more, that you do isolate more. And the isolation can also feel painful. And the photo with the crowd at the bottom is because many times people will say, even in a room full of people, I feel isolated. Right? We feel different in grief. And so honoring that. And then the secondary losses, people grieve over feeling different. They say, I normally would enjoy these activities and I'm not. So they grieve for that. Sometimes I call it like the lost sense of self because they feel so different. And so we grieve for that as well. The journey of grief, often unpredictable. We talked about that. Non-linear and unending. And that little graphic kind of shows what that experience is like. One of the things I think about in it being unpredictable, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit in grief triggers, but I remember it isn't uncommon to hear people will share, I had this huge grief wave at this time when I never would have expected it. And one experience that I hear of often is in the grocery store. People don't expect that the grocery store is going to be the grief trigger that it is. But when you think about it, well, there's a lot in life around food. and maybe this person lived with us, or maybe they didn't, and this was their favorite recipe. And now I'm cooking for one, so sometimes that can be really difficult. And so the story I always think about when I talk about the grocery store was a number of years ago. I had this mother in my grief support group, and her teenage son had died. And so she came to group one night, and we had talked about a couple weeks before how painful the grocery store could be. We got on that topic. So she came to group, and for lack of a better word, I'm going to say she had these goodie bags. And so she had a bag for all the other parents. And in this bag were her son's favorite things that he used to throw in the cart: the Slim Jim, the Ghirardelli caramels. I still remember things that were in that. And she shared with the group, it felt so good to buy these things because I have so been missing. And she said, now don't get me wrong. When he was with me in the store throwing those things in the cart, nope, that's not coming. Yet she just was yearning for that. And so she got to do that for the group. And it was just so sweet and just so touching. So C.S. Lewis says it well: grief is like a long valley. Sometimes you are presented with exactly the same sort of country you thought you had left behind miles ago. So why this is really important for you to remember is we don't do grief in set stages. Oh, I went here. I went through my anger. Now I'm going to go through this. And so sometimes we tie it into Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages, which there's definite similarities as she created her stages for the dying patient. And they do transfer over into grief, but they don't happen in stages. As you know, you might feel all of them in one day. Or people will say to me, gosh, Kathy, why am I so angry? I felt like I already went through that. It's like, well, no, something else maybe comes up and we process that. And I hear that a lot. People say, why is this coming up now? I thought I had sorted through that. And I often will say we feel things on our grief journey when we can. We can't feel everything all at once. No way. And so sometimes we feel these things as we're able and as we can. So I've talked a little bit about grief triggers, and so I think these are some more that we are familiar with, right? Holidays. So a big one right now that I can tell you we're talking about in my group with parents, really both parents, as we approach Mother's Day and Father's Day, right? So we know in grief that there are specific holidays and days that are very painful. And so special occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, many times people will say, I felt like their birthday would be difficult, but I didn't realize my birthday would be so difficult, right? So this is someone we love, and maybe we had traditions around that, or we were used to them calling us, so those are certainly triggers. The anniversary of the death or diagnosis, or for those of you whose loved one was on a journey, related to their illness, we remember some of those instances when treatment may have changed, or maybe when treatment stopped, or hearing difficult news. And people will say, why is it so painful this year? I don't remember it being so painful last year when it was happening. And I often will say, well, many times when we're going through it, you're so task focused and caring for your loved one, and it's hard for us to really feel it at that time too, right? Because that feels scary to feel it sometimes. So sometimes you may find that then on that first year of that, you may kind of feel what you didn't last year or a previous year. So social media can be a big grief trigger. Now, this social media wasn't around when I started this presentation, so of course that's been added, but I hear that a lot, right? Because you visually look at a news feed on social media and you may see what you're grieving, right? A parent and child, a couple together, okay? And so that can be a big grief trigger. So I'll talk about, maybe there are people that you just won't follow for a while, or you won't access their social media if that feels so triggering. How about for some of you, music? Yeah. So music can be a big grief trigger, and we can really feel emotions with certain types of music. Relationships. So what I mean about that, kind of like I was talking about with the social media, but you may be out and see a parent, a mother and her son, and you're either grieving your mother or your son. And so when you visually see that relationship or maybe a couple together, that can be a grief trigger because you're visually seeing what your heart is yearning for. Mm-hmm. Travel locations. So there may be places that you went with your loved one or maybe places you dreamed of going. And so when you see those or go there or think about that, that certainly can be a trigger. So I remember a big grief trigger, and I'm not a baseball fan, I'm sorry, so I don't know the year. Maybe one of you here does, when the Giants won the World Series the first time. 214. Okay. So I remember that being a real grief trigger for some of my clients because their loved one was a huge Giants fan. And they would say, "Oh my gosh," they would have been so excited. So they grieved that they didn't get to see that. And I remember, I don't know when the Red Sox won either. But but I remember this media story of this man that went out and took his radio to the cemetery and sat at his dad's grave because and he was like, I need to listen to this game with my dad. Right. So there's these things that connect us forever. As it relates to special things that we did, travel, locations, food, family dishes. So sometimes we'll talk about on holidays or birthdays, do you make their favorite dish? We do some of that in our family. And just in remembering, because there's a lot of comfort many times in food as well. We talked about the grocery store, special events, and locations. So for some, it's helpful to see different models of grief. So I've included some in the presentation. This model makes a lot of sense to me, and it may to you as well. And this is called the dual process model. And so loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. And you can see in loss-oriented, that's where we are experiencing that grief and having the emotions and relinquishing those continuing, how do we do this world without them? Like all these things that have changed for us in the death. And we feel, sometimes we kind of deny that. We don't want to how can this be so? This doesn't feel fair. We feel all of those emotions. And then in the restoration oriented, that's more kind of doing new things, attending to life responsibilities, some more distraction. So that might be that moment, like I talked about, when you're out with a friend at lunch and you are able to laugh a little bit. And so identifying new roles and identities, relationships. So we oscillate back and forth, which is necessary because to stay in that loss-oriented, that's often where the pain is, right? And the suffering. And so you're going to find that you will oscillate often back and forth. That doesn't mean when you're in restoration, you're feeling great, by all means. But that means that there's a shift maybe from that more intense emotional component that happens in the loss-oriented. So this is a bereavement study, and when my colleague and I were putting together this presentation and trying to figure out if we would put this in because we're so qualitative research, and we looked at the numbers, and then we looked at the work we do, and we said, yeah, this makes some sense. But what I want to say is it was a huge study, and you may not be exactly where this study presents looking at the sample and the large participants, but I think that you can possibly relate to some of it. So it identified phases of bereavement. So the first phase is shock and numbness, the first phase that they talk about. So you can see how that's really intense at the start, right? So people will say, they wake up and say, is this real? Or for those of you remember very early on in grief where it waves in and then you almost shut down and feel numb. And then it might wave in again and you kind of shut down. And it's that shock and numbness. And I will liken it to someone kind of putting this big blanket on you and just kind of calm. It doesn't feel calming, but just kind of this place of almost a numbness. And you'll go in and out of that. So stimuli can be very difficult. You may find that crowds, loud noises can be really difficult at that time. Judgment making, functioning, maybe more emotional outbursts of emotions. Again, they often come in and out, and stunned feelings. So you can see how that's really heightened at the start, and then see how that decreases. And so you notice that that goes down significantly, and you kind of see where that's at the 4-month mark. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. The second phase that they look at, again, phases are not stages in and out, but just experiences of grief, is searching and yearning. And that's really one of the most common and prevalent symptoms that stays pretty heightened through. So when you think about it, right, and I'll often talk about our head and our heart being in different places. So in your head, you would say, I know that my loved one has died, yet your heart can be in a really different place. And there's this deep yearning for them and searching. And clients will even say they'll find themselves searching in a crowd, searching in the sky. And that's that yearning. Now, if I ask them, do you think you're going to find them in the crowd? They would say no. They know that they're gone, but there's just this deep searching and yearning that happens. So again, more sensitive to stimuli, maybe more feelings of anger or guilt coming in, more restlessness, impatient. Sometimes people talk about just feeling ambiguous or just having this sense of apathy too, kind of this flat shutdown that occurs. And also testing what is real. And what we mean by that is people will really think, well, gosh, is there any way that they could come back? Again, they know in their head, but their heart just will do this reality testing. Is there any way this might not be real? Okay. Sometimes we'll say, oh, they're in denial. And even the way we say denial, we almost even use a tone when we say it that feels pretty judgmental, right? But why do we go into denial at times? Because we're just not ready to take in, our heart isn't ready to take in this information. And so sometimes we go in and out of that. Disorientation, so feeling more disorganized, depressed, more sense of maybe more feelings of guilt, interrupted. It says anorexia. I hear people report a lot. They'll say often initially maybe they had the loss of appetite, but it's not uncommon that then there's also an increase of appetite that occurs because food can be a comfort. And so I really see both. And then the awareness of the reality of the death. So do you see how that awareness has kind of peaked at that 4 to 6 month mark too? Okay. So I'm going to tell you something else that happens at the 4 to 6 month mark is here's the support system has decreased. So if you think about the slides, feeling more disoriented, the reality of death, if you remember from a previous slide, that really comes in at the same time when the support system has shrunk. So people will say to me, my neighbor's grieving, my sister's grieving, my coworker lost her son. What's the best thing I can do for her, Kathy? And what I always say is be the 4 to 6 month person. Because that support system has significantly shrunk at that time, and that can also be a time where other components of grief can feel stronger. And then this last phase is reorganization. So maybe a sense of relief, kind of some renewed energy, feeling that judgment making has changed a little bit. So identifying that and how that goes over that course as well. Now, this is often everyone's favorite slide, and I do email these slides out a lot because people say, okay, so that's grief, right? That's what it looks like. That's what it feels like. It's all over the place. It's different colors. It's going every which way. So again, I do find that people say these slides are helpful in giving them a little bit of a framework. So I want to talk about unique needs of grief. Now, I'm quite certain that many of you get a lot of opinions on what you need in grief. Am I correct? Oh, yeah. A lot of people like to tell you what you need to do to make it better or to make it go away. So you get a lot of suggestions about belongings. I don't know why you're holding on to that stuff. You're just making it worse. You need to clean out their room. That's just making you sadder. Well, you know what I say, the wrong thing to do is what your heart is not telling you to do, right? So if you have a desire to keep your child's room the way it is, keep it as it is until you're ready to do something different with it, or maybe you're not. I think that people have a lot of judgment on that, again, because it evokes feelings and that there isn't an understanding sometimes, right? And so belongings, we're often really attached to things too. And if you rush through them, I remember a client at the thrift store trying to find some things that flannel shirts that she had given away and she wished she wouldn't have. You don't want to rush, right? Because there's memories and attachment sometimes to these belongings. So honor them, do what you need to do. So one time in group, we were talking about belongings that bring us comfort. And so I'm always sure when, like in session, when someone says, Kathy, you're going to think this is weird, but I know that they're either going to talk about a belonging that comforts them or feeling their loved one's presence, right? And I'll say, probably not. And so we were talking in group, the loss of child group, about belongings and belongings that brought them comfort. And quickly, one mother reached into her purse and she pulled out this soft towel that was of a particular color that was her special needs son favorite color. And it was really soft. And she always had these with her. And she continued to carry this because this was just a source of comfort and connection, kind of a linking object, right? And then as soon as she finished, the mom next to her reached in her purse and rolled up, little 5-year-old Rapunzel nightgown because her daughter loved Rapunzel. And she carried that nightgown with her. And we went around the group and parents talked about, not everyone pulled something out of their purse or their pocket, but it was such a safe space to talk about that. You know, and we would say, and sometimes we'll laugh and I'll say, now, you know, if we're at Starbucks and people were listening to our conversation, they'd be going, oh my God, are you kidding me? They've got this stuff in their purse. Yeah, the truth is it's more common than we think. And I say, if something brings you comfort, then honor that. One of my favorite stories, I had a client and her mom was at the hospice home and she would put chapstick on her, you know, because her lips were drying. And she had the chapstick, and she said, sometimes I just put the chapstick on because I want to feel that connection to my mom, right? And isn't that beautiful? But people sometimes feel like they can't share that, like, you know, that there would be judgment around that. But it's just, and again, this judgment sometimes comes because it evokes feelings, right? So belongings. Changes, for some of you, you may be forced to make some changes. But we always encourage, you know, talking to a loved one, kind of processing through that, really thinking through that. Photos, for some, photos can be more painful than others. For some of you, you might have certain photos that trigger more emotions than others. And so sometimes you may put a photo up for a time. Or I've even had clients that maybe they have a big photo on their nightstand and they're having sleep issues. And I say, I wonder if that photo impacts it. What would it be like if you moved it across the room? Maybe they don't want to, and that's fine. Maybe they'll try and see if it helps. So there's some different strategies that you can do as well. Rituals, I'll talk more about. I strongly believe in using rituals in grief to connect. And then information. For some of you, you may have wanted to know a lot of information about things around the illness or the death event. And that's another area where sometimes people have a lot of opinion. Oh, don't go there. Don't ask why. You know, and it's like, well, we kind of ask why until we're done asking why. And we have different levels of doing that. So really just honoring that as well. So briefly talking about children in grief, although we have a lot of resources in the Center for Grief and Healing for that. Always want to be open and honest, using the word died and death, which is hard because we don't even use that word a lot in our society, right? And so we want to use those words, supporting their emotional expression, whatever that is, and then even sharing our emotions as well. So many times people will say, I don't want to cry in front of my children because it'll upset them. It's like, well, okay, so yeah, it can be hard for kids to see their parent cry or that people they love cry. But if no one cries in front of them and then they feel like crying, they're going to think that it's not okay to cry, right? So how do you do that and allow them, and you just name it too. I feel really sad. I miss dad. I miss grandpa. And so really, using, touch, nurturing in that way, and encouraging questions, remembering that you don't have to know the answers. So one thing I really think about now, and when I think about children in grief, is some years back I got a call from a father, from a gentleman whose wife had died suddenly, and he needed to tell his daughter, and I feel like she was maybe about 5 or 6 years old. So someone had suggested he call and talk to us to just get some help in how to talk to his daughter. He needed to tell her that day. And so I was walking through it with him and giving him some ideas and talking about that. And then he said, Kathy, I just don't want to do it because I am going to change her life forever. And the responsibility he felt, and just really validating that. So I share that because I know as parents, it's so hard to share news or support your children in grief because your heart's hurting and then your heart is grieving for your child as well. So reach out for that support and know that we have a lot of support as well. Creating rituals and embracing memories. Those who have lived in our hearts are never really gone. As long as we keep them with us in our hearts and our thoughts, they will be with us always, for love, which is timeless, never ceases to exist. So a ritual is really anything that feels healing to us, or helps to serve as a connection with our loved one when we think about that in grief. And it may evoke tears or feelings of sadness. And so this was recently a topic in my support group, as they were looking at some significant dates coming up, and do I want to do a ritual, do I not? And we just really processed that. And sometimes people's rituals change through the years. So you might not do something on year 1, and maybe you'll do it year 2. So one of the things that I do, and I can't, in all honesty, tell you how many years after my dad died that I started doing this, but his birthday is November 8th, and my dad taught me my love of ice cream, which I love and curse him for. And so every November 8th, I go to Baskin-Robbins, because my dad used to take me to Baskin-Robbins, and that was something we enjoyed. And my dad's favorite ice cream was pralines and cream. He was from Alabama. And so when I transitioned from bubblegum, because that was my flavor for a long time, of course, as probably many of you as kids, right? Then I loved pralines and cream. So every November 8th, I go to Baskin-Robbins and I get an ice cream. And sometimes I go alone, and sometimes I may cry, and sometimes I take it out to the cemetery. And so a couple of years ago, my sister-in-law was here visiting, and it was November 8th. And I said, well, I'm going to go to Baskin-Robbins. And she said, okay, she knew I did this. And she said, can I go with you? And I said, oh, absolutely. So we drive over to Clovis and Herndon and walk in, and I order my pralines and cream. And they said, oh, we're out. What? So I told my sister-in-law, well, we got to go. I think she thought I was. She went with me, and we went over to Sean Clovis, and we got pralines and cream. But it's so about that ritual. And I feel really connected to my dad when I do that. So again, rituals to help us feel connected. So you might think about, what that is for you. So sometimes they're private. Sometimes they're more public. We have events here at Hinds, our tree lighting, our time to remember, things like that, where people come together. Might be more formal and informal, religious or non-religious. So there's a lot of, in our culture, we've gotten away from rituals, I think, a lot through the years. But I think it can be so meaningful. And it might just be putting up a wind chime and sitting and thinking, or going to a special location. And so just whatever serves to help you feel connected. So I want to talk about self-care. My clients hear me say a lot, be gentle with yourself. because we have a lot of expectations of ourselves in grief. Well, just in life in general, right? Well, I should be able to do this, and I need to pull up the bootstraps. And so I use the best friend barometer. Okay? So if you would not give your best friend the same advice, then don't give it to you, right? So maybe it's someone that's grieving their dad and they have yet to get married, and they're like, Kathy, I have this wedding invitation. I don't want to go. I know that that's going to evoke so many feelings in me to see, a father of the bride, or right. But I need to be able to go. I just need to be able to do this. And so we talk about, well, do you? Maybe not. And what would you tell your best friend? And it is very interesting because people usually would tell their best friend something very different than they would tell themselves. So just encouraging you to think about that barometer. Accepting support, that can be hard too. Many times people will say, well, I'm the one that likes to support others. It can be vulnerable to reach out for support, things like that. But I think the truth is that when you reach out to support, guess what you're going to be for that person? They're going to reach out to you because you gave them permission to do that. You showed them, and it's a real strength too. We talked about creating a ritual, nutrition, rest, and exercise. That can be difficult. Appetite is often impacted. I talked about that. Sleep for most grievers is disrupted, and it might be falling asleep or staying asleep. And so some things that you can do around that can be helpful is, one, I'll talk about your bed. I'll ask my clients, when you grieve, when you like curl up with the Kleenex box or let yourself feel, where is that at in your house? And many times they'll say, in my bed. I'm like, okay, let's figure out a different space, right? So that we can find, a different spot. Like the bed we call the no grieving zone. So is there another spot you can go to when you really are just having those emotions, okay? And taking a couple deep breaths before you get into bed, and just really reminding yourself of that. So it's really thought stopping. Okay, I'm not going to go there. But the truth is, what happens? You get into bed, it's dark, it's quiet, you don't have any distractions. And you just start going and thinking about maybe events around the death, what could have been different. Sometimes those guilt and regrets come through. So again, really using that thought stopping, and then taking your mind. There's a lot of great phone apps for guided imagery, working to take your senses somewhere else, and then incorporating that self-talk. And it can be very helpful. Is it going to work every time? It's not. But if it works, because what does grief feel like the next day when you didn't sleep good? It's already hard enough. And then you are tired on top of that, right? So really trying to do that for yourself. So a story I think about in that is a couple that were in my group. And so she came back to group the next week and described how she had woke up and she just could not stop thinking about their child and grieving. And so she woke her husband up and she's like, we got to go downstairs because remember, this is our no grieving zone and I can't stop grieving. So you may need to do that too. But some of those things can help with sleep too. Pamper yourself. We have a worksheet that is in your packet for those of you that were here, and we can certainly mail the packet to those of you that are joining us online. And it just has a butterfly and numbered 1 to 10. And what are things that you can do to just kind of nurture your heart and nurture yourself and take care of yourself? And I'll encourage even putting that up on the refrigerator and making sure, this isn't bad for us just to do in general, right? So how do we take care of ourselves? We talked about the thought stopping, sleep and relaxation, and then again, really reaching out for support as well. So when maybe will you want to seek some additional help? And a client sent me that little picture right there that I really liked. And sometimes grief feels that way, right? And so sometimes you can just talk to someone. That could be a friend, that could be a therapist, that just kind of helps you sort through it. That can certainly be a resource. But when do you seek additional help? If you're finding that you're having any self-harming or self-destructive behaviors, Excessive alcohol use. You know, it isn't actually uncommon for people to increase their alcohol use and grief. I'll hear it a lot around, I'm having sleep issues. If I drink more, it helps me sleep. And so what I really talk about is just moderation, and that it actually does not help us sleep better. It's a more disrupted sleep and not as sound asleep. And so just to really be aware of that and just monitor that. Any use of illicit drugs, any suicidal thoughts or actions destructive to others, lack of self-care, excessive isolation. So these are just important things to remember that, you know, maybe I need to reach out for some more formal support as I'm noticing some of these behaviors. So I think, you know, one of the things when we talk about in finding your support system, and we'll even talk about finding your doer, your listener, and your respite. And so your doer is maybe for some of you, you've got these things around the house that you need help with getting done. And so who might be someone you can reach out to help you do that? Your listener is that person that can just sit and be present with you and just listen. And they're not going to try to take your feelings away. They're going to just be able to sit with you in that. And then the respite is that person that you feel a little bit lighter when you're around them. They can make you laugh. So who are those people? And then how do you reach out to them for support, which again can be hard, but just I really encourage you to reach out and let others know how they can support you, because what happens is we tend to support people in the way that feels right for us because we feel like that makes sense, okay? But that might not feel helpful for you at all. So how do we just say to people, this is what I need from you right now? So really encouraging you to do that to the people that you're closest to. And so this is a favorite little short video of mine that's just a couple minutes that I want to share with you. And so I always say we all need a bear. We all have a goat, but we don't need the goat. And so I'm going to play this video.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
one of the reasons that we do this is I think it also can really serve to join you and can be quite validating when you hear of others' experience. Um, so, what is your biggest concern or challenge in your grief journey? Because I'm in a different geographical location with a whole different life routines, sometimes I feel disconnected to the person I'm grieving. Yeah. So sometimes that separation, or we talked about how things feel so different as well. So then feeling that disconnection based on the geographical location. Yeah. Biggest concern or challenge, guilt that I didn't do things good as I could have, should have been doing during our journey. So again, this is not uncommon to feel that or to experience that. So just really honoring. Again, remember what you tucked away, what you're glad you did, and then also being able to process, maybe in the form of a letter, those things that you maybe wish would have been different. Biggest concern or challenge, creating space and time to grieve well, especially with the chaos of the current COVID situation. I'm glad that someone shared this. So currently right now, as we're in the stay-at-home orders, we know that that isolation really impacts us as well, and for those grieving. And so maybe not having the support system around. I know one of my clients that we, of course, are also doing telehealth and supporting in that way. But so she has one support person that will come over and they talk in the front yard at 6 feet apart. But, just not even having that physical connection can be really hard, or connecting in that way. Biggest concern or challenge, dealing with all the gifted objects she gave me over the years before she died. So we talked about the belongings and how difficult that can be to go through those, and what do we do with those, and we just aren't sure sometimes for a time. So really allowing yourself to do that on your timetable and your pattern. I have no energy and I can't regulate my sleep time. So emotional exhaustion is very debilitating. Biggest concern or challenge in your grief journey is being alone. Yeah. So feeling that loneliness that we talked about, that really is also more heightened right now. That if I move on, I will forget my husband. Yeah. So we talked about that recovery, feeling that guilt that comes with that. And I'll often talk about, we adjust. I know sometimes in our society we use the term like move on, but I think it's more like an adjustment, adjusting to this life without them, which is not easy. And there's a lot of phases to that. For this person, their biggest concern or challenge is their anger. And so, what do we do with that? How do we feel that? Some people feel it's not okay to be angry. Some people might feel angry at the person that died, right? And so I say anger is also an emotion that's not wrong. We just, we feel, we experience it. It's not like we wake up and go, well, I think today I'll feel angry. And then we judge ourselves for feeling that. And so what do we do with that anger? And that can be a hard one. Sometimes I'll even talk about getting out a notepad, like a yellow legal pad, with all the lines, and start it with, I'm angry because, and just go. And don't censor it, and just go and write everything that you feel angry about, and doing it without judgment, okay? Biggest concern or challenge, understanding why my brother took his life. I'm up and down about this, and it's depleting. And so we're trying to make sense of things. How did this happen? And we do a lot of that in grief. We call it meaning making. It's a reconstruction theory too. Like, how did all this happen, and how does it fit together? So that's a big part of that processing as well. Energy to do daily activities. Keeping my grief in a container. So That's hard, right? Because it comes out and when we least expect it to. So, how do we manage that? And sometimes it comes out and we feel that and the emotions are evoked. And I do an exercise with my clients and we build a container. And so I'll say, what material is it made out of? It's really strong. What material would it be made out of? And they'll say steel or oak, or they choose the material. And I say, okay, let's picture it. And then it has a big solid lid made of the same material. Okay. And then I say, so sometimes, especially when it's even more around trauma things, around grief, I'll say sometimes you need to you'll put the stuff in the container and you'll clamp down that lid. Okay, because sometimes we do need to do that best we can. Interacting with others whose lives have and should move on while I'm stuck in my grief. So again, feeling really different. Okay. And sometimes people will say, how is this world just going on? Everyone's just going on. And my heart is so broken. My world feels so broken apart, right? You feel so separated and different. And the biggest challenge for me is that I feel alone on this journey. People are tired of me grieving, even though it has only been 19 weeks. People tell me I'm strong and that it will pass, and that my son would not want me to cry. Yeah, so we're going to cry. 19 weeks. Wow, that's not very long. So how do you just honor your heart and find those that you can be present with and that will allow this grief? Because this can feel very painful too. And of course our loved ones wouldn't want us to feel sad, but we do. We grieve. Grief brings sadness. So this can be a little bit shaming and guilt provoking too, right? And so, this is your journey, and yeah, just honoring that. And I can tell you, grievers tell me all the time they do not like to hear people tell them they're strong at all. Because what it translates to them, and I would have not known this, I probably didn't know this before I did this work, I know I didn't, is when they hear that, they hear, you must not have loved as deeply because your pain isn't as bad. Because your pain, you have that strength. So that sometimes they hear that. So again, as a reminder, our well-meaning self might say those things, but that's typically not something that feels helpful. And then lastly, response is, I can't find my shutoff valve. And when the tears come, I'm not able to continue talking. So yeah. So I think, one of the things, thank you so much for sharing. And, it touches our heart, doesn't it, as we hear other people sharing. And then for many of you, I also think it connects your hearts, right? You're like, oh, yes. That's what I love about doing grief support group. So for those of you to know that we have our grief support groups here at Hinds, and we'll be starting up another session in the summer, and that'll go for 10 weeks. And so we have, like mentioned, the groups are related to the relationship and that connection. So loss of child, loss of parent, sibling, loss of partner, spouse. But I'll tell you, in my group this week, my heart was just so touched in watching them connect and validate and support one another. I mean, it's just incredible, because although their journeys are unique and different, there's just something about how people come alongside each other and support. And so what I would also encourage is just being mindful of where you're at without judgment, honoring those feelings. They're not wrong. So mindfulness meaning paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, without judgment. So I would encourage you to daily ask yourself, what do I need right now? We don't do a very good job at that, of checking in with ourselves, right? So to just pause, and you're having whatever emotions they are, and to say, what do I need right now? And then listen for the answer. So a funny little story about this. I had a mother in my group, and I was giving this kind of assignment to the group. Okay, so this week, every day I want you to ask yourself, what do I need right now? And then this woman raised her hand and she said, Kathy, in 80 years, I have never asked myself what I need. I don't even know how I do that. It was pretty amazing to watch her transformation through group, how she started to get comfortable. So I just encourage all of you to ask yourself that question and be mindful, because many times you'll have an answer. Maybe I'm going to reach out to my friend. Maybe I need to cry. Maybe I need to, right? So just listen and pay attention to that. So when we think about self-care, I like this quote. I've come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival. So one of the things that I see in doing grief work is I really am able to bear witness to people learning how to take care of themselves and reach out for support and nurture their heart and do those things that are really essential in grief and for healing on that journey. So in closing, I just want to read you this blessing, and I send it to you. May the spirit of wholeness be with you, awakening healing power within. May the spirit of harmony restore rhythms of body, mind, and spirit. And may love touch you, strengthen you, and give you peace. Again, please remember that we remain available for support in the Center for Grief and Healing, and that we really carry you in our hearts at this time. Thank you and take care.